Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2013. In this section we're going to continue our review of the use of the financial functions in Excel 2013, and we're going to extend the case study that we looked at in the preceding section. Now, in the preceding section we produced this worksheet which we can use to compare payments on a loan over various durations at a fixed interest rate. Now, we're now going to make this a little bit more sophisticated, and we're going to say that we want to do the same sort of analysis, but we want to do it on the basis of two input variables, two things that can vary: the duration of the loan, say between 5 and 40 years, and variation in the interest rate as well. Say we'll make a minimum interest rate of 1% and a maximum of, say, 6%. So what we need to do is to turn this solution into a two-dimensional solution. And the way that we do this in Excel 2013 is to set up what's called a data table. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is pretty much obliterate all of the data we've got so far. We're not going to need any of that. And what we're going to do instead is I'm going to just put in 3 of these cells the basic values that we're starting with. So the purchase price of the house, we'll stick with house purchase, and there we are. I've set all of that up fine. Hopefully you wouldn't have any trouble setting that up yourself, including formatting each of these cells in the correct way. So I've got a currency cell there with no decimal places, a percentage cell, and a cell that's defined as having a number content with no decimal places. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to type in this cell here the formula to calculate the interest payments. Now, you should be able to do that as well by now, but let's just go through it again. I don't have to use the dialogue, by the way. I can actually start typing and let Excel help me as I go. So I type equals PMT open brackets. Now, can you remember what these things are? What's the rate? Now, that's the rate per period. So that's the annual interest rate, which is currently C3, divided by 12. I'm going to assume monthly payments. I don't have to, but I'm going to assume monthly payments. Then it's a comma. Then it's NPER. That's the number of periods, which is C4 times 12. Then it's another comma. Then it's PV, which is effectively in this case the purchase price, which is C2. Now, the other two, you notice how the arguments have brackets around them, those sort of square brackets. That tells you that those arguments are optional. You can leave those out. The ones that don't have square brackets you have to put in, but the ones with square brackets are optional. We know that they're optional. In the final value we want a 0, and the type, it's actually a type 0 as we saw before, but it will default to being that. So close the round bracket, tick, and we have the payment. Now, the payment is the same payment that we had before, of course. Now, what I'm going to put underneath where the formula is the list of percentage interest rates that I want to be able to see the monthly payments for. So I've selected a whole load of cells there. I'm going to format those cells as percentages. So format cells will make them all percent. And then I'm going to go down going 1, 1.5, so on. So I said I'm going from 1% to 6%. And then on this row next to where the formula is, I'm going to put in the durations in years. Now, the durations in years are just numbers, so I'm just going to select some cells along there. I'm going to format those just as numbers. I don't need decimal places, so click on OK, and then I'm going to enter 5, 10. So I've got up to 40 years, and now what I'm going to do is to create this data table that I mentioned earlier on. And the idea is that you select the number of rows that covers the whole range plus the formula, which you really need to be in this corner, with one set of variables below it. So in this case the range of interest rate percentages below it, and the other variable, the second variable in this two variable table, to the right of the formula. So this is going from 5-year duration to 40 years duration. And what we do is make the minimum rectangular selection that includes all of that. So basically the selection is that. Now, having made that selection, you then, on the Data tab on the ribbon, go to the Data Tools group, and one of the options there is What If Analysis. Click on the drop down, and one of the options is Data Table. Now, with this little dialog, what we need to do is to tell Excel which of the cells that's used in the formula corresponds to the values in this row, and which of the cells that's used in the formula corresponds to the values in this column. Now, the row, where we've got this row of values here, they're the durations in years, and that corresponds to the cell C4, which is the duration here that we originally used in the formula. So the row input cell is $C$4. The cell we've used in the formula corresponding to this column here, the annual interest rate column, is C3. So in here we put $C$3. And now Excel can relate the values in that row, the values in that column, to the values that have been used in the formula. So we click on OK, and it comes up with a number of values. Now, all we now to do, let's just change these back to a currency type. So select all of those. Currency with 2 decimal places. Click on OK. Now we've got a more realistic representation of what the monthly payments are. And this data table gives you a very straightforward way of reading off what the payments would be under a combination of durations and interest rates. Obviously you're going to be in a better position if you have a fixed interest rate over the period of a loan, because you can pretty much guarantee what the payments are going to be. But even if you don't have a fixed interest rate, it does show you how the payments will vary as the interest rate fluctuates over the term of the loan. Now, as you can see from this, the use of two variables makes this a much more powerful tool. And you may now think, well, what about 3 variables? Could I go into a third dimension? Now, in terms of representation in a straightforward way in a worksheet, I'm afraid you can't. You can actually work multidimensionally in Excel, but not quite in this way. But you can deal with a more complex situation with more variables by using some of the other facilities in Excel. Now, those facilities are outside the scope of this course, but if you are interested in using these types of technique, you really need to look at what-if analysis generally in help, and then look at things like scenarios and the scenario manager. And just to give you a very brief idea of how you might use the scenario manager in a third dimension, you could run this analysis, say with a purchase price of $300,000, then run it again with a purchase price of $250,000. So effectively imagine building up sheets with those different purchase prices. And what the scenario manager does is make it easy for you to manage that type of situation where you're managing a third variable or even more than 3 variables. So I hope you found that introduction to data analysis and the use of financial functions in Excel useful. I'll see you in the next section.